Good evening. Good evening. Thank you for speaking back. We fed you, so you should be awake, correct? All right. I am Andrea Blackman, and I am delighted to host tonight's conversation at NPL with Dr. Ibram X Kendi, author of Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. I would like to extend lots of thank yous. First, start with our Library Foundation, who makes so many of these programs possible. I would like to thank our library, our National Public Library System, of course. And for those of you who do not know, we are the 2017 Library of the Year. So clap. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. So that is, you know, when we were in Chicago and DC over the summer with some of our interns, one who's back at the door, we knew we were Library of the Year, and our interns were like, can we just tell everybody and brag? And I was like, wait till we get back to Nashville. It's not gonna be well received in Chicago and DC, so we are excited. So thank you. Thank you on behalf of Nashville Public Library. I am excited to see the overwhelming number of college students with us tonight. Some of you have traveled from Kentucky, some of you have traveled from Georgia, some of you are Fisk, Geitz, some of you are Lipscomb, Bison, Vanderbilt, Peabody. Did I miss, are there any TSU students? Yes, thank you, and I recognize TSU as well. Thank you. And any other local college and institution, we thank you so much. Thank you. Tonight, just to give you a brief overview of what our evening would be like, we are going to start with a lively conversation between our two panelists. We will talk about some issues that will make some of us uncomfortable, but we hope that you will engage with us. After our talk, we will have time for Q&A. We will ask that you direct your questions. We will probably cut you off because I'm sure there's almost close to 200 of you in here, and we may or may not have time for all 200 questions. We will let Dr. Kendi give me the word when to cut it off. Thank you. All right. So after that, we will also be selling books, thanks to Parnassus, who's selling books out in the lobby with us tonight as well. Our book, our featured topic in our conversation, Stamped from the Beginning, is the winner of the 2016 National Book Award for Nonfiction. It's listed as New York Times bestseller in race and civil rights, Boston Globe Best Book of 2016, finalist in the 2017 Writing Legacy Award in Nonfiction. I'm going to keep going because very seldom do you have an author at this age with so many accolades. So I'm going to keep going. Washington Post's most notable nonfiction book of 2016, nominated for the 2016 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work of Nonfiction, and most ambitious book of 2016 by the Washington Post. So, some of us are watching what's going on right now on social media. Some of us are looking at our news or just walking around and trying to grapple what is going on. We're asking ourselves and questioning this idea of what is post-racial. We are dismissing all of those myths. We know that Dr. Kendi in his book argued in Stamped from the Beginning that how we must first understand how these racist ideas were developed, disseminated, and enshrined in American society. And that is why we're here tonight, to have that conversation. So our author, historian and author, professor of history and international relations, and the founding director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. Grew up in Jamaica, New York, in Queens, moved to Manassas, Virginia as a high school student, and this is probably the best part of his bio, matriculated to the illustrious Florida A&M University. Do you know how long I have been waiting to welcome another Rattler to Nashville Public Library? So I will clap Dr. Kendi if nobody else claps with me. So, for those of us who are bleeding orange and green, we are super proud on that part. So Dr. Kendi went on to earn his doctoral degree in African American Studies from Temple University, published, all right, for Temple, look at this. We're going to give shout outs all night, Dr. Kendi. I'm so sorry. He has published numerous essays, won many awards, and we are so happy that he is here with us in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm joining Dr. Kendi on stage in conversation is Dr. Crystal deGregory. Crystal is no stranger to Nashville Public Library, nor to the city of Nashville. She is a historian and storyteller whose research interests include Black higher education and college student activism. And the last time I had the pleasure of welcoming Crystal to this stage was for the inaugural year of HBCU Story Symposium. So welcome back, Dr. deGregory. She was recently named the director of the Atwood Institute for Race and Education and Democratic Ideal at Kentucky State University. She is in her, see, these folks travel from Kentucky. You can shout, it is okay tonight. Thank you so much. So please, Nashville, Tennessee, and Nashville Public Library, join me in welcoming our guests tonight, Dr. Ibram X Kendi and Dr. Crystal deGregory.
Dr. Kendi, the dedication of this book begins in an interesting place. To the lives they say don't matter. What does that mean?
Well, first, I'd like to sort of thank everyone for coming out tonight on a Friday night. Crystal, I'd like to thank you for moderating this discussion. Of course, I'd like to thank Andrea and the library for hosting this event. It's truly an honor for me to be here in Nashville, and it's an honor to be here at the most illustrious library in the country. So I actually started working on this book a few weeks after we heard about the death of Trayvon Martin, and I finished the book around the time we started saying her name, Sandra Bland, around the time. And so that sort of gives you a sense of what was happening in this country, you know, as I was writing, as I was looking into the history of racist ideas and seeing, of course, that history play out in the ways in which certain people in this country and certain lives did not matter. And so for me, I felt that it was important for me to dedicate this book to really the moment or the series of moments that really gave life to this book, right? Because I was, of course, like all of you, not just, I was watching and studying and crying and getting angry and sad and even sometimes happy with protest over all of these different things that were happening in the street, and all of that was impacting the book. And so, that's why I basically decided to dedicate it to the lives they said don't matter.
I would imagine, and as all of us well know, that if we were to look at the statistics and make any comparison for the death of civilians, unarmed civilians, at the hands of police, we would see a startling difference along racial lines. But those aren't the only lines in which we'd see different. Your book opens with the difference in median wealth of households, the difference in incarceration rates, the difference in the nation's wealth and the way in which it is shared. How do you think that those statistics bear on the way in which we view ourselves and each other?
Well, I think those statistics are a reflection of America, of course, and I think they cause Americans to ask the question, why does racial inequality exist and persist? And this question, so I mentioned, I think in the prologue, how between, 2010 and 2012, young black males were 22 times more likely to be killed by police than young white males. I mentioned in other parts of the book how over the last 50 years, the black unemployment rate has consistently been twice as high as the white unemployment rate. Whites have about 15 times more wealth than black people do in this country. The incarcerated national population is 40% black, even though black people represent 13% of the population. And so the question, these racial disparities, these racial inequities are nothing that's new, right? This has always been the case in the United States. And so from the beginning of this country, Americans have been looking out at this racial landscape of inequality and have been trying to basically answer a very simple question. Why does it exist, again, and persist? And trying to answer that question, I think, is the fundamental sort of conflict and debate, really, in STEM from the beginning. And because there's sort of multiple positions. And I think the easiest way to understand it is there's one position that states that inequality exists because black people are inferior. There's something wrong with black people. The reason why the black unemployment rate is twice as high as the white unemployment rate is because black workers are lazy, is because they don't want to work, is because they're not qualified, is because something's wrong and inferior about black people. And then on the other side of the equation is those who state that, no, actually, there's nothing wrong with black workers. The racial groups are equal. And the reason why we have disparities and inequities in this country is because of racial discrimination. And so then you have a third position that states, well, actually, it's both. Yeah. It is the case that racial discrimination exists, but it's also the case that black people are inferior. And some of these people would say that black people are culturally inferior. Others of them would say that black inferiority is the result of discrimination itself. So poverty is not just impoverishing black people financially, it's literally impoverishing their values. Segregation is literally dehumanizing black people. Abolitionists oftentimes made this case that slavery was literally making black people into brutes. And so we need to end slavery, which is discrimination, but we also need to civilize black people. That's the sort of third position. So Americans have been sort of arguing this really from the beginning.
You say it has allowed Americans who think something is wrong with black people to believe somehow they are not racist. And, you know, that brought me to a very difficult place because you admittedly say that, you know, in writing this, it caused some introspection on your own part and, you know, changing a kind of academic and intellectual positioning also required a change of a personal positioning, a personal viewpoint. And there are 3 points in particular at this juncture I'd just like you to kind of bear out. And so one is, and you don't say this, but I'm going to say this because I believe it to be true. So I'm saying this, Dr. Kendi is not. We all hold racist notions of black inferiority in some way. Now we can go back and forth with that. I think it's something that we have to work hard to undo. It's as natural almost as breathing air. And I think the point that makes this expressly clear is when you say that anyone can consume or produce racist ideas of African inferiority, and that includes black people. I just want to give the example of who's been a child? Everyone in here everyone's been a child. Everyone's been a child. Okay, good. Everyone's been a child. Who has ever been a child that's waited on the ice cream truck? Anybody? Anybody? Okay, everybody, mostly, okay. And the ice cream truck sings a song. Somebody's like, no, they didn't go to the ice cream truck. Wow, okay. It's an interesting household, neighborhood. No, but you remember the ice cream truck sang that song, and everybody heard it, and when you heard it, you knew it was the ice cream truck, right? And obviously, there are different people who have different positions on this, but there was a very popular article on NPR that went viral about the minstrel origins of this song. And so I wonder, how do you disconnect from something that you've internalized without even knowledge that you're consciously taking on a position, especially for Black people that is self-harming?
So I think this was, of course, probably one of the most difficult aspects of writing this book and investigating the history of racist ideas, because I realized once I ended up defining a racist idea, and I defined it as any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. And this book, Stand from the Beginning, was about anti-Black racist ideas. So racist ideas suggesting that there was something wrong with a Black racial group. And then when I sort of laid that out, what I mean by Black racial groups is I'm not just talking about Black people in general. Black women are a racial group. So I, as a Black man, have internalized and expressed ideas suggesting that there was something wrong and inferior about Black women. The Black poor are a racial group. So I, who came up in a Black middle-class home, have consumed and expressed racist ideas suggesting that there was something wrong and inferior about the Black poor. And mind you, I'm saying the Black poor, not the poor. Because if you say, let's say, poor people are lazy, that's a different thing than saying Black poor people are lazy. Just like if you say white poor people are lazy, that's saying something different than Black poor people are lazy. So this book is about all of these racialized Black groups and how many Black people typically view their group as equal. So in other words, many Black men view themselves as equal to white men, or Black middle-class people view themselves as equal to white middle-class people, and Black heterosexuals view themselves as equal to white heterosexuals. But then when you start diverging, then we begin to sort of, then we look down on the poor, Black poor, we look down on Black women, we look down on the Black LGBT community, we create all of these. So anyway, so this book isn't just about racist ideas about Black people in general. It's about all of these different groups, and Black people too have contributed to the production of ideas about each of these groups. I show, I think, pretty intensely the ways in which Black men have contributed to ideas about Black women's inferiority. So to get one of the most popular ideas of the 20th century is this notion of the broken Black family due to the Black matriarch.
Yes.
That idea largely came out of the work of E. Franklin Frazier, a Black sociologist from Harvard, who was, and another person who actually said that idea was W.B. Du Bois in his Black family study in the first century of the 1900s. This was a very prominent idea, particularly among Black male scholars. And then, of course, later, a white sociologist by the name of Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote the Moynihan Report in 1965, and then that idea went viral in the way we understand it sort of today. And then it became the basis of policy. And then, as a result, the Black feminist movement emerged to challenge that racist idea as they described it. And so the other sort of side of it is I came to recognize the function of racist ideas. So what does racist ideas literally do to a person? And once I realized the function, I realized that function was operating within every group of people, because it really was not necessarily, had to do necessarily with race. And what I mean by that is the function of racist ideas historically has been to suppress resistance to racial discrimination. In other words, in our society, when you have a racial inequality, there's only two causes. Either it's the result of Black inferiority, or it's the result of racial discrimination. So if you, no matter the color of your skin, believe that Black people are inferior, then you're going to spend time resisting and challenging who? Black people. And simultaneously, you're not going to challenge racial discrimination. And so that's why when you look at African American history, we've had so many Black people who spent so much time resisting Black people because they thought Black people were the problem, as opposed to challenging discrimination as anti-racists have. And then finally, I would say that I think one of the ways that we are able to move away from our upbringing and racist ideas, because I don't know whether I'd go so far as to say everyone has racist ideas. I would go far to say if you grew up in this country, then chances are you're going to be to basically be nurtured in racist ideas. But instead of us striving to not be racist and standing up and saying, I'm not racist, which is the sort of slogan of, quote, non-racism, and I found that every person who has said, I'm not racist, is racist. Instead, we should be striving to be anti-racist, right? And so that's why in the book, I showed the difference and the conflict between racist ideas of racial hierarchy and anti-racist ideas of racial equality. And I tried to show what it means for people to think and act as an anti-racist. And so that's what I think we should be striving to do. And I do think there are people who have been able to strive to be an anti-racist. And I say to be because it's not necessarily a fixed category, right? Because you can say one thing that is anti-racist in a speech, and then the very next day you can say something that's racist, right? And so you go from being an anti-racist to a racist, in a matter of 2 days. And so, but I think we can strive to express racial equality and to focus our time on challenging racial discrimination. I think that's possible.
Why you gotta give Du Bois a hard time? You know, I'm a Fiskite. No, I'm gonna get back to that.
Okay.
Beat up on it's a home team. You done came to Nashville. Okay, we own him more than Massachusetts. We think we do, at the very least. But I wasn't gonna quite go here this quickly. But since we're here, let's talk really about whether or not we can achieve anti-racist ideas without intersectionality. Can we continue to think that everybody has a cause and that it is not necessary for us to join other causes that we, for whatever reason, are not naturally inclined to join? So, for example, I'm a black woman and this is hypothetical, this is not really my position, but I don't understand LGBTQ things, and I don't want to be, I don't mind them doing their thing, but that's not my thing, or yes, we have causes and concerns, or for example, black men, they causes and concerns behind which they're ready to get behind, but I'm not ready to go to a women's march. Mm-hmm. Or, I'm ready to wear a hoodie for Trayvon Martin, but I just as easily accept that Sandra Bland, who had a new job on that Monday morning, who got pulled over for not failure to signal, went into a jail and hung herself. And I accept that without question. Similarly, the same way in which we now have the story of the 19-year-old girl, and somehow people accept that she locked herself in the freezer. Really not even without serious interrogation. So, is it possible for us to really interrogate anti-racist possibilities without seeing both oppression and opportunities for freedom in people whose experiences are not exactly, or even in our minds, remotely like ours?
So the short answer is no. And
I didn't think so. I just wanted you to know.
This is I can let me explain this. Racist ideas are fundamentally intersectional, right? And so in order for you to be an anti-racist, you therefore have to have an intersectional analysis. And let me give you a few examples. Sexist ideas suggest that women are weak and men are strong. Anybody heard those before? Racist ideas suggest that black women are not really women, that white women are the real women and black women are not. So then when you think about their intersection, right? Their intersection creates this idea of the strong black woman who is inferior to the peak or pinnacle of womanhood, who is the weak white woman. And I'm sure everybody knows how prevalent the concept of the strong black woman is, and even how prevalent the concept of the weak white woman is. Turning it over to men, again, if a real man is strong, right, the way that intersects with racist ideas that say that black men are not really men is it creates this concept of the weak black male, the emasculated black male. So within African American sort of culture, you have this idea of the strong black woman and the weak black male, neither of which are, both of whom are inferior to white womanhood and white masculinity. But you can only understand those ideas as racist by understanding them from an intersectional standpoint. Or going over to notions of class. It's a very prominent elitist idea that suggests that poor people are lazy, and that's why they're poor, right? Most middle and upper class people either somehow don't know or fool themselves into not knowing that poor people actually work longer and harder than every other class of people in this country. But that's what they say, right? To justify their riches and their poverty, that these people don't have because they're not working as hard as I am. So that is a very prominent elitist idea, right? And then there's a very prominent racist idea that suggests black people are lazy. And so then when we put those two ideas together, and you see their intersection, they intersect to create this idea that black poor people are lazier than white poor people. And that is why white poor people can receive or are deserving of welfare, but black poor people who are lazier are not. Or you take homophobic idea that gays and lesbians are the most hypersexual people in society. They're more hypersexual than heterosexuals. And then you take the racist idea that black people are more hypersexual than white people, right? And the way those two ideas intersect is to say that the black LGBT community is more hypersexual than the white LGBT community. Right, you see those sort of intersections. And so then you get black people black heterosexuals thinking that they are not as sexual as black gays and lesbians. Or that white gays and lesbians are not as sexual as black gays and lesbians. And, we see all of these sort of ideas playing out. And so, one of the things I realized through researching many of these intersections is that it is literally impossible to be homophobic, to be sexist, to be elitist, and be anti-racist. It's impossible. And so in order for you to truly become an anti-racist, in order for you to truly believe that all black lives matter, you have to adopt a feminist perspective, right? You have to adopt many of these perspectives that people don't think they have to adopt in order to become a true champion of the black community.
So I think hypersexuality is something that, on the one hand, black women try to shirk. On the other hand, black men pursue because of the very things you've talked about. But there has been, in our experience, the practice of exceptionalizing certain behaviors, certain characteristics. You say in your book that no racial group has a monopoly on any trait, good or bad. However, is it not true that black people are or naturally athletic or more gifted in rhythmic and dancing. So these are some of the things that that Black people have internalized and have accepted with some mantle of pride even. You know, we dance better, we jump higher, we jump further. They, of course, are related to the argument of physical prowess that undergirded slavery, or even, you know, spirituality with Uncle Tom's Cabin. So how is it achievable, really, to get a community to see that exceptionality has a double-edged sword?
I think that is the difficulty. I think particularly Black people have suffered through centuries of degrading ideas about the way they look, about the way that we act, about the way we think, about everything, right? And so in order to build a sense of self, it in many ways became necessary to embrace ideas that rendered Black people in positive ways. And so historically, Black people have been looked upon by white people in a more positive way as it relates to sports, as it relates to sexuality, as it relates to music, as it relates to spirituality, and a series of other sort of things. And of course, we know that there's this concept that Black people have soul, right? And I have one of the chapters in the book is called Soul, in which I sort of talk about the origins of that idea. We know the ways in which Black people take pride in the Williams sisters and LeBron James and many of the athletes who dominate sports. And, you know, we take pride in the great dancers and singers. But I think what Black people don't understand, and what I didn't understand before researching this book, is the origins of these ideas, right? And when we think of the racial hierarchy, typically the Black-white racial hierarchy, we typically think of two steps, sort of white over Black. There's actually a famous book on racist ideas called White Over Black. Yep. But what that leaves out is the third and most important step, which is animals. And so you really, when you think of the racial hierarchy, it's not just white over Black, it's Black over animals. And so when those who've created racist ideas, they weren't just stating that Black people are inferior to white people. They were simultaneously saying Black people are like animals. And the way that they're like animals is because animals are simultaneously the most physically superior beings on earth, but simultaneously do not have reason, right? And so the way that the racial hierarchy was constructed was to basically say that whites are over Blacks because they are smarter, they're more intellectually superior, they have reason, while Blacks are closer to animals because of their physical superiority. They're so close to the most physically gifted beings on earth. And so then that transferred into the way that operates is that's the reason why these people should be enslaved, right? You know, they're so physically fit that they are able to sort of withstand the sort of physical rigors of slavery. That is the reason why, you know, any sort of physical trade is sort of natural within Black bodies when it comes to the physicality of dancing or the physicality of singing or the physicality of sex or the physicality of spirituality, right? And so, yeah, of course, Black people are going to be better in those things because those things do not necessitate reason. Those things are more inherent. So people are born great singers. They're born great in bed. They're born all of these things. The irony is that that's actually not true. right? You know,
Shucks.
people who are in the NBA or Whitney Houston or all these great people, they actually had to practice, right? They actually had to have discipline. They actually had to have intelligence. But anyway, this is the way it was conceived.
Allen Iverson didn't need to practice.
Yeah, when he got to the NBA, but I'm sure before that. So I think what we should understand is that when black people say they are by nature, or even in other capacities, better in these physical, what's conceived of as physical sort of categories, they are simultaneously embracing their closeness to animals.
I think you described it as smart in slavery, or maybe this was Jefferson. Smart in slavery, but stupid in freedom.
Yeah, that was my analysis of.
There were a few moments when I just wrote on the page, Lord, with a T. Lord. I said I'll come back to that later. One of the things I want to talk about is, because you talk about the role of ideas, is the role of education in these ideas. We, of course, know, because you told us, that Du Bois was not perfect, which we had thought previous to this that he was, especially as a Fiskite. I know. Tried it. You know, he didn't write about nobody who went to FAMU. That's the next book.
He applied, he didn't get accepted. I'm sorry.
Hold on, let me get my notes. Hold on, because I know you didn't try that, because in my notes.
No, I don't think it was, FAMU wasn't even founded.
Yeah, I know, but in my notes, I took special note of the way in which you described Fisk University. You said Du Bois attended, this is a quote from your book, quote, and I quote, Du Bois attended the nation's best historically black college, comma, Fisk University in Nashville. I just wanted to put that out there.
I mean,
but no,
mm-hmm.
I know. We're still there. We're working on it. So I want to ask you about not just the economic and financial complicity of centers of higher education in slavery and racism and racist ideas, but the form and function of education, so that Du Bois, even having attended what we now call a historically black college and university, had internalized these racist notions. So what, if you will, is really the role of education and of higher education in particular, historically, in contributing to these ideas, and in modern times in dismantling them?
Well, I think that historically, people are not born with racist ideas, right? They learn racist ideas through their parents and through their schools and through the media, and historically also through the church. And so typically those four sort of institutions have been the key sort of recyclers and even developers of racist ideas. And so then when we think about it more specifically to HBCUs, whether Fisk or FAMU,
Fisk first.
These institutions also were recyclers and expressors of racist ideas, particularly assimilationist ideas. And so in the book, I try to demonstrate that there are two kinds of racist ideas. That there are what I call segregationist ideas, which suggest that black people are biologically and naturally and therefore permanently inferior. And so it's impossible to civilize and develop these people who are by nature inferior. And then there's assimilationist ideas that suggest that black people are inferior, not as a result of nature, but as a result of nurture. And that black people, because they're not inferior by nature, because we're all created equal, they can be civilized and developed. And so therefore, the job of higher education is to bring these uncivilized, barbaric blacks to a higher plane of civilization. What the HBCUs believed, and the founders of HBCUs, who were, of course, a collection of northern white missionaries, and typically southern black elites, was that the pinnacle of education in the United States, in America, in the Western world, was Greco-Latin education. So those who were smart knew and studied Aristotle. Those who were smart and learned had and were able to sort of understand a Eurocentric education. That was considered education. And so then it was the job of the educator to basically civilize these black people into these higher sciences. And so that's what HBCUs did. And these students who went to HBCUs, like Du Bois, who went at a time in which segregationist ideas that were saying that black people could not learn Latin and Greek, that black people could not read these higher sort of sciences, went there with a tremendous motivation to prove that black people were capable of doing these things. And so then they went there and did it, like Du Bois did. He went to Fisk, graduated from Fisk, right? Then he went on to Harvard, and then he wasn't finished. He went on to the most illustrious white university in the world at the time, in the 1890s, the University of Berlin, because he wanted to show black capability, that black people were capable. And the whole concept of capability, you're fundamentally assuming what? You're assuming that something has to be shown that black people have not already achieved. And so, I think that desire that really not just Du Bois, but a large swath of what Du Bois himself called the talented 10th, that they were seeking to more or less show what black people were capable of, that black people were literally capable of becoming white. And segregationists were like, no, y'all are not. And their white assimilationist friends were like, yes, they are, and we're going to help them. And anti-racists were basically sitting on the sidelines of history saying that, well, actually, these people are already equal. The culture that they're expressing in rural Tennessee is equal to the culture of white people in Boston, right? That's what anti-racists were saying, right? Even these people who cannot necessarily read Latin or Greek or even English were still literate in a different type of way. And we should not be measuring literacy from any particular group standard, right? There are multiple forms of literacy. But when we standardize any form of literacy, you're fundamentally going to create a hierarchy. And so that's, of course, and so black people believed in that hierarchy and strove to go to the top of that hierarchy as opposed to rejecting that hierarchy outright. And I should say that Du Bois, in particular, by the end of his life, started to reject that hierarchy outright. And that's why by 1948, he rejected the concept of the talented 10th and started calling for what he called the guiding 100th.
The cruel illogic of racism. When black people rose, racists either violently knocked them down or ignored them as extraordinary. When black people were down, racists called it their natural or nurtured place and denied any role in knocking them down in the first place. So it really is fighting a losing battle. One of the things that I thought was so telling way up front in the beginning of the book, because we live in a very social media oriented world, and if you're on anything like Facebook, for example, anytime anything happens that is in the media, some of us feel the burden to talk it out, to explain it, to demonstrate why this is wrong, what white privilege is, what racism is, why is something racist or a racist idea. And I don't know how much of that you negotiate in forums such as this. But I did think it was interesting when you said that we should know that the principal producers and defenders of racist ideas will not join us in anti-racist pursuit or discovery. I mean, how much of this exercise is really for us as individuals versus, I am anti-racist, and here, you come and be anti-racist too. Because I am almost of the opinion, and mostly of the opinion, that people have their own enlightenings, they have their own awakenings, their own aha moments, Oprah calls it. And you can lead them to the well, you can show them the water, you can put Kool-Aid and sugar in it and make it real good, red preferably. And still some people do not want to drink. Mm-hmm. So how much of any burden does an anti-racist have, or responsibility does an anti-racist have to recruit, if you will, others to the cause?
So I was, I think, pretty clear in the prologue that this book is for open-minded people. People who are willing to critique themselves, people who are open to accepting new ideas, people who I consider to be intellectuals. Because to me, the intellectuals are people who, not necessarily people who know a lot, but people who have a tremendous desire to know. And if you have a tremendous desire to know, then you fundamentally are going to be constantly critiquing yourself and your own ideas. And so, I was sort of pretty clear that this is who this book is for. And so I think what anti-racists should do is I think we should distinguish between the open-minded people who don't know and want to know, and the closed-minded people who think they know and don't want to know, right? And we should also, and so for me, I do think anti-racists should be willing to engage those people who are open-minded and want to know. And I think we should leave alone those closed-minded people. In a larger sense, I think the fundamental thesis and finding of Stand from the Beginning sort of turns our sort of perspective of the problem and the solution of racism on its head. And so we have largely been taught that really the root of this race problem, the roots of racist ideas, is ignorance and hate. That people who express racist ideas are ignorant and hateful, and that's why they expressed those things. That's why they produced those ideas. They did not know or they hated black people. And then these people with racist ideas, these are the people who are behind the racist policies like slavery, segregation, or even mass incarceration. This is the line of causation we've largely been taught, that ignorance and hate leads to racist ideas and racist ideas leads to racist policies. Well, I found that that line of causation is ahistorical, and it's actually been the inverse, that racist policies have been leading to racist ideas, and the consumption of racist ideas have been leading to ignorance and hate. Now, how does that happen? Again, going back to earlier when I said that there's only two causes of a racial inequity. Either it's discrimination or black inferiority. And so if you have created a racist policy that causes a racial inequity, and you benefit from that racist policy, which is precisely why you created it in the first place, then you are not going to want people to resist that policy so you can continue to benefit from that policy. So how do you get people to not resist that policy? You make them believe that that inequity that came about as a result of that policy actually did not come about as a result of that policy. You make people believe that the cause of that inequity is black inferiority. You produce racist ideas to defend your policy so that nobody challenges your policy and they spend their time challenging black people. And then your policy is able to continue. You're able to continue enslaving black people. You're able to continue segregating black people. You're able to continue mass incarcerating black people because everybody's thinking that black people are criminal-like or black people should not be drinking from the same water fountain because they're so dirty, or black people are fit for slavery, right? You have now convinced people of that. And when I say people of that, white people of that, and even black people of that, which is why they're not resisting slavery or segregation or mass incarceration, because they think, right, that black people should be in that. And so, that's really the history that I tell. Really a history of economic, political, and cultural self-interest leading to the development of racist policies, and the efforts to defend those policies leading to the development of racist ideas, and the consumption of those racist ideas actually leading to ignorance and hate. And so then if that is if that is the actual line of causation, then that changes the solution. Because we have long focused on educating away the racist ideas of the producers, thinking that they were producing them out of ignorance. It makes sense. Like, you're saying this because you don't know, right? Trump is saying that there's all this voter fraud because he doesn't know. So let's show him all of the data that shows that voter fraud is not a problem. That's what people think that will actually solve the issue. Or what if he's saying this? What if producers of racist ideas are saying those things to justify their policies? Right? So then you can't educate them away from those ideas because they're actually creating them out of knowledge. And so really the way racist ideas have functioned historically is almost like the PR arm of the company of racist policies, right? A company produces harmful products. They want us to consume those products. How do we consume those products? Because they make us believe, their PR arm makes us believe those products are not harmful. The business executives know that the products are harmful. They created them. They were there at their origin. They benefit from those products, but they want us to believe that those products are not harmful, right? So we won't resist that company, so they can continue making money off of those products. That's the way racist ideas have historically functioned. And so when we think, therefore, about education, we have to distinguish not only between the open-minded and the closed-minded. We have to distinguish between the producers of racist ideas and the consumers. So typically the producers of racist ideas are clearly closed-minded because they created them to defend a racist policy, while the consumers of racist ideas are more likely to be open-minded. And so we more have a capacity to educate them away from racist ideas because they've been taught to think that the problem in society is black people. And we can presumably, if they're open, show them the data that that's not true.
Come on, y'all. Give Dr. Kendi a round of applause. We have mics at both sides of the rear of the auditorium. If you have a question, here's your time. If you don't, I have a page full of notes. I can keep going.
Now, this might be a personal question, so I don't know if you're open to answering personal questions.
It's okay.
But can you divulge your X in your name? Because the X has history in this country, and I wanted to know if you wanted to expound on that.
Sure. So I won't tell you my birth name. So when I was married in 2013, my wife and I decided to change our names together, and the last name we chose was Kendi, and I also decided to change my middle name, a given name that my mother even disliked, or my father insisted that I have that name. And so I changed that name to Zolani, which means peace in Zulu. But I also recognized the role and the history of the X, right? And I, as somebody who studied Malcolm X very closely, for me, it does have a double meaning.
Yes. What is your view on Make America Great Again, and with just this administration as a whole? I mean, I know we don't have access to the Justice Department like we used to, and you think we're going back to the 50s and 60s, and like in Nashville, we have growth of 100 people moving in daily, and they're building all over the place, and it looks like it's more of an influx of more whites than blacks. So is this a return to segregation more so than anything else?
Yeah, so thank you for your question. I think one of the other storylines in Stamped from the Beginning that I had to sort of wrestle with is this whole concept of what emerged, particularly as I was writing this book, this concept of racial progress. And I was trying to sort of figure out how is it that we can simultaneously have the first black president and more black people in prison than ever before? How is it that simultaneously we could have so many black people who are visible through their wealth or even through the media, but simultaneously black poor people are poorer now than they were a generation ago? How could all of this happen simultaneously, right? And our traditional way of thinking about this has been to imagine that the nation has been on this sort of racial march. And we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or 1 step forward and 2 steps back. Anybody ever heard that during Black History Month? Every Black History Month, we hear somebody say that analogy, or we say it, right? But once I sort of started studying this racial history that I simultaneously had to chronicle as I was chronicling the history of racist and anti-racist ideas, I realized that this singular sort of march that we have long been taught does not necessarily fit with the reality. That we've actually had a dual march. That we've actually had a dual racial history. That we've had racial progress. And that racial progress, to a certain extent, was personified in the election of Barack Obama. But we've had a simultaneous progression of racism, which I would argue was personified through the election of Donald Trump. And so if Obama represented racial progress, then Trump represents racist progress. Typically, racist progress has followed racial progress. Those who instituted racist policies, when activists broke down those barriers, those people who benefited from those policies did not just go home to their places in Florida or New Jersey, if y'all know what I'm talking about, or to their towers in Manhattan. They typically created new and ever more sophisticated barriers, and then they created new and ever more sophisticated racist ideas to justify those barriers. And so that is how you've had racial progress in a certain segment of black people being able to sort of rise, but you've simultaneously had racist progress. And so that's really, I saw this dual history. And I think the election of Donald Trump was, I would argue, not because so many black people chose not to vote, not because white women voted for Donald Trump, not because so many Latinos voted for Trump. It was because of the suppression of votes. A suppression of votes that began, the plans for it began when a particular political party realized that they no longer had the demographics and the ideology of the country on their side. So then they went about creating, when you don't have the votes, what do? Right? It's pretty simple. You take away votes. And so that's what they attempted to do. They created this narrative of America being post-racial. That's the narrative that the Supreme Court used in 2013 to gut the Voting Rights Act, which eliminated the federal preclearance of new voting laws in key historically racist states. And then those very states instituted all of these voting ID laws, which suppressed votes. In Wisconsin, estimates are 200,000 votes were suppressed. Trump won by 22,000 votes. We saw this happening all over the country, which then allowed for the Republican Party to maintain or gain the Congress and the election of Donald Trump, primarily off of a more sophisticated version of voter suppression. Like that's what I mean by racist policy. I mean, that's what I mean by racist progress that I think Donald Trump is a representative of. And of course, if you are imagining, if you're coming on the back end of a black male as president and a woman as a candidate for president, and you want to make America great again, right? It clearly is obvious what that means, right? This country was founded for white men by white men, as Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, once said.
Friends, we have time for 2 to 3 more questions, and then we're going to make our way outside this room for a book signing with Dr. Kendi.
How are you doing? My question is, it seems that you said that we're trying to educate away racist beliefs. So would you say we're kind of fighting the wrong battle? And if we're not, do you believe that it's kind of like a two-sided battle where we're trying to educate, where we should be educating away racist beliefs of the consumer of racist beliefs and finding a strategy to combat against the producers of racist beliefs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So what historically has worked in terms of the elimination of racist policies has not been racial reformers convincing racist power that those policies were bad for black people. That has not worked. What has actually worked has been social movements have forced racist power to realize that those policies were no longer in their self-interest, or anti-racists have been able to get into positions of power where they, of course, implemented and instituted new anti-racist policies. And so if we're thinking about reducing racial inequality or eliminating racial inequality, the only way to do that is by eliminating racist policies. And if we're thinking about how historically have Americans been able to eliminate racist policies, it's primarily been 2 ways: protest power or getting in positions of power. Now, in order to, of course, mobilize people for protest, you have to get the consumers to recognize that the problem is not black people, right? And the problem is those discriminatory policies that you want to protest against, which is why it still is important to a certain extent, do that educational work, but within the context of mobilizing people for a larger struggle.
Going back to your earlier comments about the rise of Trump, I think part of what I have read is that he played to the fears of white people who see themselves becoming a minority and potentially being, treated as minorities have been treated in the past. And I'm saying going forward, are you optimistic or pessimistic that our country can eventually overcome these fears and anxieties of the white community to say we can eventually have equality and have a society that is truly equal for all? So I'm just curious about how you feel about the future. Is it optimistic or pessimistic?
Sure. So, I think just like ignorance and hate comes out of racist ideas, so too do fears come out of racist ideas. Because if you have been led to believe that when people of color sort of come into your community, they're going to basically bring criminality, it makes sense when you see people of color coming into your community for you to fear them, right? And if you have been led to believe that when immigrants come into your community that they're going to sort of take your jobs because they really don't really necessarily need money to support their family so they can undercut your wage, if you believe that it makes sense, you're going to fear them. And so what I'm ultimately saying is that I think what Trump was able to do was he was able to generate these fears through the racist ideas people already had, or by creating new racist ideas to sort of double down on their fears. I think one of the things that white Americans don't realize is that racism has actually, for the vast majority of white Americans, has actually not been in their self-interest. And so when we look at American history, when we look at the sort of South during slavery, when we look at 1860, we see a very small group of a couple thousand extremely wealthy white slaveholders, and we see 5 million poor whites, and we see almost no middle class. Right, when we look at, let's sort of fast forward, we see white middle class America thriving the most in the 1960s. And then they start sort of voting for these people who want to basically cut all of the very programs that allowed them to thrive, because they convinced them to vote for them on this idea that if you vote for me, I will eliminate welfare, I will basically be tough on crime, I will challenge affirmative action, when in fact they wanted to basically gut your standard of living like they were gutting the standard of living of black people, while simultaneously increasing theirs. So as a result, over the last 40 years, we've seen this growing economic inequality among all racial groups. Even in white America, the white middle class is shrinking, and the white middle class has been led to believe that black people or immigrants or Muslims are to blame, which makes sense, right? Again, going back to the context of, if you don't want your policies to be resisted, you're going to convince people that somebody else is to blame. And then they're going to spend their lives blaming those people and then voting for you while you're basically undercutting their standard of living. This is essentially what racist politicians have been doing really since the beginning of this country. And so, I sort of show this. And to give one obvious example, anybody heard of George Wallace? George Wallace, who in 1963 became the governor of Alabama, and stated in his inauguration speech, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And he's identified as like the arch enemy of Martin Luther King, like a die-in-the-wool, super racist, right? But what people don't know about George Wallace is George Wallace became that to get elected. So he lost the previous governorship race by a politician who was endorsed by the Klan. And he was like, I will never be out-niggered again. That's what he said. And so then he changed his political sort of persona, right, for the votes, so he can get in positions of power. And so, I'll stop this.
We have time for just two more.
Friends, we have two more questions, one on this side, one on this side. If we'd like to continue the conversation, please hit us up on social media.
First, I want to say thank you so much for the book, and particularly for that clarification of that sequence and the relationship between the thoughts, the policies, and the behavior, because I think for me, it gave word and a meaning and explanation for what, over time, I have come to see in doing that work of diversity training, or whatever we want to call it today. But my question for you is, you mentioned earlier that we should focus on identifying the consumers of the racist ideas and not focus on the producers. Do you have some ideas or suggestions as to how to do that? Of course, there are some producers that are really obvious. Legislators, certain people in certain classes, I think, come to mind along class lines. But how in your day-to-day work, for those of us who are educators who work around trying to fight that battle, how do we identify the consumers? And where do we begin?
So when it comes to education, I do think, of course, we should focus on educating the consumers. Outside of education, when we think in general, I think we should focus on challenging racist policies, right? Because that's really what's going to lead to the elimination of those ideas that are actually defending those policies, right? Back to specifically to your question, I think that there are people who are coming to us and asking questions, right? And sometimes they're saying things that are racist, but at least they're coming to us and asking questions. To me, that's an obvious indication of a consumer who is open-minded, who wants to know. Then there are also people who are willing to presumably go to events like this, that we have in institutions across this country. That also is typically a sign that that person is open to new ideas. And then when we are able to, when these people are sort of going to these spaces, these diversity spaces, these spaces in which people are talking about race, I think it's important for us to first and foremost recognize them as a consumer, and so possibly somebody who is open-minded. And then what I sort of try to do in those discussions with those people who are coming to those spaces with racist ideas is the most important part of any workshop is defining a racist idea. That you cannot talk about race at all with people who have racist ideas and don't know those ideas are racist until you define a racist idea. Because then once you define it, right, once you establish that that is a racist idea, right, and then you start having that conversation about, okay, you know, whatever sort of racial inequality or whatever racial problem, and then when that person says something that is racist, what can you then do? Well, according to the definition we just established, that is a racist idea. You know, you said you were not racist. You can't be not racist and be expressing racist ideas, right? And so again, I'm saying I can go sort of get more specific, but I think the biggest aspect, the biggest thing that I think open-minded people don't realize is what is a racist idea. And so that is how they're so able to consistently say things that are racist, even though they're sort of open because they don't know, right? And so it's our job to define them in a very concrete way for them. And then for us to apply that for them so they can see precisely how the ideas that they've consumed are racist.
Hello. I was just curious about, we talked about assimilationist racists, and I was curious about what are some prominent figures, contemporary and historical, who have been racist, and what exactly exemplifies that?
So I think Du Bois by the 1930s had largely given up on his earlier ideas, rendering something wrong with the black poor, which I think really sort of haunted him for a large part of his life. I think he rejected assimilationist ideas, and wrote a very seminal essay in 1935 called A Nation Within a Nation, in which he basically stated that, why you have these black institutions, why are black people spending so much time trying to break down the walls of institutions that don't want them? And they should be spending their times building up the walls of their own institution. And he rejected those who tried to make the case that those white institutions were superior to the black institutions, which is a very prominent sort of assimilationist idea within the black community. I'm striving to be in that white space because I consider it to be superior to my black space. And he had long thought that, but rejected that by the 1930s. I also chronicle the anti-racist ideas of Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston, who was one of the people who was widely critiqued by Richard Wright. Richard Wright, in his writings, made the case that black Southern people and their culture were inferior, and which is one of the reasons why he left the South. He grew up in Mississippi, right? Of course, Zora Neale Hurston, who was really the voice, right, of black Southern, particularly rural culture, showed in her work that there was nothing sort of wrong with this culture. If anything, they had a very sophisticated amount of folklore that she tried to basically express in her work. She rejected, and so as a result of showing really the imperfections of blackness, of black people, as opposed to those who were trying to sort of show the perfections of black people and therefore show what black people are capable of, she rejected that. No, I'm just going to show black people for what we are. And what we are is equal. And so the people like Richard Wright and others critiqued her for doing that. And so Zora Neale Hurston, I sort of show her. Of course, the last major character in the text is Angela Davis. Angela Davis, who really I saw the ways in which she, I think partly because of her upbringing, in a family with two activist parents, really was able to not necessarily consume many of the racist ideas that other people were consuming when she came up on Dynamite Hill in Birmingham. And so I sort of show her life of anti-racist ideas. And I don't want to get into it because, you could read the book.
54 years ago today, 4 little girls met their deaths. Tonight we speak their names: Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley. We thank you for spending this evening with us at the National Public Library. We thank Dr. Kendi for his time and his talents and his treasures. And we ask each and every one of you, as you leave this place, to leave this place a better person and to leave this world better than you met it. Thank you and good evening.